Go ahead and look. I hope you like what you see.
Brandon Shaw is a psychopath high off his own twisted interpretation of the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche. He goads his friend Philip Morgan into committing the perfect murder. The film begins as the two finish strangling to death one of their own former classmates from Harvard named David Kentley. Then they throw his corpse into an antique chest, and as any sane people would, promptly invite all of the dearly departed David's friends and family over for dinner. Among the lucky guests is their old prep school housemaster and fellow Nietzsche enthusiast, Rupert Cadell, played by Jimmy Stewart. Rope shares a lot of different themes in common with MGSV, largely being the questions of society, superiority, crime, and punishment. Skullface and Brandon are both quote-unquote deviants whose suffering they project outward onto innocence. Both are also somewhat enslaved by their own twisted interpretations of influential role models, surrogate fathers, and phantoms. But most importantly of all, both believe in a kind of grand experiment to prove that they are superior beings crowded by a world of infidels. In that regard, you might say, both embody aspects of the American dream.
Do you like what you see?
Go ahead and look. I hope you like what you see.
I said, do you like what you see?
I have no proof of this, but I'm almost convinced that the voice actor for Skullface was picked because of the similarity of his voice to Brandon's.
You've thrown my own words right back in my face, Brandon. You were right to. If nothing else, a man should stand by his words. But you've given my words a meaning that I never dreamed of. And you've tried to twist them into a cold, logical excuse for your ugly murder. Well, they never were that, Brandon. And you can't make them that. There must have been something deep inside you from the very start that let you do this thing. But there's always been something deep inside me that would never let me do it. And would never let me be a party to it now.
What do you mean?
I mean that tonight you've made me ashamed of every concept I ever had of superior or inferior beings. And I thank you for that shame. Because now I know that we are each of us a separate human being, Brandon, with the right to live and work and think as individuals, but with an obligation to the society we live in. By what right do you dare say that there's a superior few to which you belong? By what right did you dare decide that that boy in there was inferior and therefore could be killed? Did you think you were God, Brandon? Is that what you thought when you choked the life out of him? Is that what you thought when you served food from his grave? Well, I don't know what you thought or what you are, but I know what you've done. You've murdered. You've strangled the life out of a fellow human being who could live and love as you never could. And never will again.
What are you doing?
It's not what I'm going to do, Brandon. It's what society's going to do. I don't know what that'll be, but I can guess. And I can help. You're going to die, Brandon, both of you. You're going to die.
Cadell makes a big speech at the end of Rope with a genuinely moving moral with more than a grain of truth in it. Only Rupert in the end determines the awful truth, and when he finally convinces the two murderers to show him what's inside the locked box, Brandon then says the line that's echoed by Skullface. But if you pay attention, you'll realize he's actually mimicking Brandon's own rationale for killing David. Claudel essentially asserts his interpretation of Nietzsche's is the right one because he, not Brandon, is the only one with the superior enough mind to truly understand the great philosopher. Claudel then blames everything on Brandon's own twisted logic, taking no responsibility whatsoever for influencing Brandon, for putting Nietzsche in the mind of such a warped young man.
Now, mind you, I don't hold with the extremists who feel that there should be open season for murder all year round. No, personally, I would prefer to have cut a throat week or strangulation day.
Probably a symptom of approaching senility, but I must confess that I really don't appreciate this morbid humor.
Well, the humor was unintentional.
But you're not serious about these theories.
Of course he is.
Oh, you're both pulling my leg.
No, why do you think that?
Well, Brandon, the notion that murder is an art which a few superior beings should be allowed to practice.
In season.
Now, I know you're not serious.
But I am. I'm a very serious fellow.
Then may I ask, who is to decide that a human being is inferior and is therefore a suitable victim for murder?
The few who are privileged to commit murder.
And just who might they be?
Oh, myself. Philip. Possibly Rupert.
I'm sorry, Kenneth, you're out.
Gentlemen, I'm serious.
So are we, Mr. Kentley. The few are those men of such intellectual and cultural superiority that they're above the traditional moral concepts. Good and evil, right and wrong were invented for the ordinary average man, the inferior man, because he needs them.
Then obviously you agree with Nietzsche and his theory of the Superman.
Yes, I do.
So did Hitler.
Hitler was a paranoid savage. His Supermen, all fascist Supermen, were brainless murderers. I'd hang any who were left. But then you see, I'd hang them first for being stupid. I'd hang all incompetents and fools anyway. There are far too many in the world.
This, of course, showcases the idea that words can kill, while bringing up the quandary of moral guilt in terms of what you know or think you know you're doing when you do it. It is a kind of word or symbol, after all, that kills Brandon and the far less responsible Philip. 3 gunshots, which no one in the area will mistake as anything else than a sign of foul play, a sort of shorthand or symbol for violence and likely murder having taken place. Just look at the glee that Claudel takes in sending the 2 boys to their deaths. Rope makes the point that what ultimately shapes our fate isn't our own interpretations alone, but that of our collective subconscious, our society at large. The death penalty and even incarceration and state-run punishment all have questionable moral implications if you really get down to it. Yet we, by and large, not only tolerate these things, but sometimes even revel in them. Think of the ugly sight of Southerners bringing their whole families and having picnics for lynchings. The crowd has long learned to love the suffering wrongdoer, according to the philosopher Michel Foucault, because the powers that be learned long ago to change the norms surrounding our interpretations of penal practices, from revenge by the sovereign power or state, which more often than not would stir up a lust for revenge against that very power rather than the criminal, to rehabilitation and public moral sanitation. This way, this new way, this supposedly kinder way that prioritizes rehabilitation over revenge, through this we automatically have come to construe the criminal's enslavement inside a cage, and even their murder by the state, if I can use that loaded word, all as a public service, as something which will deter crime, police thoughts, and ultimately make us all safer. But what we may miss is this hatred and fear, and even the loss represented by the crime itself and embodied in the criminal never goes away, not really. It just gets implanted in the system, arguably, in our social norms, making us all a little more hideous by them, inside and out. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is about basically a bunch of perverts who try to rape an angel, and who God punishes by leveling their cities with giant fireballs. It has important significance for both World War II and, arguably, as we'll see, 9/11.
My village had an oilseed field and a fine factory. Every day, my friends and I would see our parents at work in that factory. That's all I had. All the world I knew. Then one day, aircraft came droning in from some far-off sky. The factory was bombed. Some spies had told them we were making weapons. The building burned. We tried to flee outside. The crowd blocked the exit. The crowd of people. Hot. So hot. I tried to push through their legs and get ahead, but a boot in my stomach put me on the ground. The smoke of them burning filled me up. I heard my name called, but not for long. At the infirmary they carried me to, a nurse in the corridor saw me and remarked, as if it happened every day, they should let the poor thing die. Those are the only words of my mother tongue I remember. It was the language of my village. Until foreign troops invaded. Then the last identity I had left, the words I spoke, were pulled from me. My skin would never feel anything again. This face would be burned again, in torture, at foreign hands. But I still writhe in that burning factory, doused in scalding rapeseed oil. That's all I have to feel, that pain. All I have to remind me I exist here. Those spies reported well. We made weapons, all right. As cartloads of rifles came in from the battlefields, we fixed them up and sent them back out, so our country could win. Or rather, so that little world we knew could continue. I came to realize I mustn't die. I'm their last hope. All those who perished and left me here. I have to accomplish something. If I don't, their will be swept out of this world. So, do you see me now?
One of the most controversial aspects to the Second World War is the conduct of the Allied Air Force during the tail end of the conflict. Now, I personally hesitate to judge, given the era's social climate of total warfare, meaning warfare without rules or any morals whatsoever, which was being waged by both sides. But there's no question that the legacy of this war has, for nearly a century, hinged on the idea of the Allies being morally superior, as being, in other words, above certain atrocities. And while the full story is more complex than what I'm about to say, and I would still hesitate to deny that the Allies had the moral high ground in the conflict, simply put, there were a number of incidents where the Allies and the Axis were engaging in wide-scale mass murder and unspeakable violence so as to become indistinguishable from good guy or bad. War, in other words, makes men, all humans, no matter how morally righteous, after long enough into monsters. Now, not all monsters are created equal, some are more monstrous than others. But this principle is why, arguably, war should only be conducted when necessary, and importantly, with no illusions of moral superiority and no narcissistic compartmentalizing away the badness of the enterprise at large by blaming the bad stuff that we don't like what we see on a rogue agent or just a few bad apples. We all know about the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But even more destructive were the air raid campaigns at the end of the war over Nazi-occupied territory and Nazi Germany. In Operation Gomorrah, a saturation firebombing campaign cooked human beings where they stood in the street and melted them, turning the port of Hamburg into one big fireball, just like the story from the Bible. That's the nicest way that I can describe it. Now, it sounds crazy, but there is a possible 9/11 connection to Operation Gomorrah, staring us in the face. Atta's own thesis advisor, the Hamburger Orientalist Dietmar Maschul. Maschul has never been implicated in the plot, and yet he once wrote a paper on the idyllic city planning of the SS in their early days when they worshipped the garden over the modern cityscape in terms of city planning. It's possible, in other words, that 9/11, at least in part, was an act of architectural protest and terrorism, a defacement of a skyline that some around the world felt was poisoning city planning and urbanization norms with its faceless and nakedly powerfully tall facades. We'll never know the extent of Maschul's Liddell-like influence on Atta's terrorism, because Maschul refuses to release Atta's thesis. As a last note, Atta has been associated also with the Cairo-based Muslim Brotherhood, who officially renounced violence and terrorism, yet whose founder, al-Banna, was an admirer and collaborator with Adolf Hitler and his Nazis. There was a long and mostly secret history of National Socialism spreading in the Muslim or Arab world. When I say secret, I don't necessarily mean that there's a conspiracy, I more mean that it's not well understood, given that in the West we tend to think of the Middle East as having a primarily Muslim identity and not as an Arab identity. Arab nationalism prioritizes the latter over the former. But don't mistake what I'm saying here as an incitement of violence against anyone, least of all Arabs or Muslims. Scapegoating is not the answer. We have to ask the hardest questions of no one more than ourselves. We have to ask if we, ourselves in the so-called West, don't share in at least some of the blame here, given the precedent that we established by World War II, which suggests the idea that morally superior sides in a war exist at all, and that their superiority gives them a godlike permission to do anything they like in their own name. Operation Gomorrah echoed the Bible verses in the book of Genesis 19. 9/11, you could argue, mimicked this sanctimoniousness as a form of revenge by way of Hamburg by echoing the Tower of Babel story from Genesis 11 verses 1 through 9. But then again, this could all be coincidence and conjecture, and this entire video nothing more than the ravings of a madman. Facts, in the end, do not exist, after all, only interpretations. But we should keep in mind that the initials DM are the inversion of MD, as in medic, as in doctor, and also McDonald's.
I said, do you like what you see?
At 6:50 or so, Chico, now staring directly at Paz's body, repeats in a stunned voice, huh? And again in a bizarre tennis match back and forth, Skullface repeats the meme, do you like what you see, emphasizing the like and see. Now Skullface returns to his pedagogical tone, except now it holds a grain of pedophilia as well. He says, conjuring a metaphor, that her body is like fruit. So here we're bumping up against the question of how monotheism became modern law. The phrase fruit here, of course, brings to mind Eve's apple, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. In turn, consider the related phrase know in a biblical sense, or carnal knowledge, the latter of which went on to become an actual legal term in the British courts in the 19th century. In fact, the boilers, too, are relics of the Victorian or steam era. They resemble the kind found in locomotives. Skullface, for that matter, is every inch dressed as a 19th century gentleman, combined with a 19th century Lone Ranger. The sawed-off was a primary weapon of the Confederate cavalry in the U.S. Civil War, and though the Lone Ranger character did not originate on the airwaves until 1933, he and his Indian old-timer buddy Tonto were pulled right out of the kinds of legends of the Old West a certain Adolf Hitler reportedly loved, like the kinds written by a fellow German, Karl May. But what the boiler room itself also sounds rather a lot like is the cavernous shell of a hangar where Solid and Liquid Snake have their final heart-to-heart in MGS1.
Trying to impress the girl, little man?
And then I'm going to go beyond.
In the words of Orwell's 1984, quote, The essence of oligarchical rule is not father-to-son inheritance, but the persistence of a certain worldview and a certain way of life imposed by the dead upon the living, end quote. The way this setting has effectively abolished the past by repurposing it and fragmenting it can also be observed in how much resemblance Skullface also happens to bear with the future appearance of Revolver Ocelot, hinting that he controls not only the past, but our understanding, our context for the future as well. Quote, to be able to learn from the past meant having a fairly accurate idea of what had happened in the past, end quote, page 250, 1984. By forging its own knockoff of the Stalinists and the Nazis and the Allies, and mixing them all together, in the novel, the party controls information, controls history, and with it, the wider perception of reality, and the possible progress that can occur, the possible things that can happen in the future, and all possible futures. Quote, one could not learn history from architecture any more than one could learn it from books. Statues, inscriptions, memorial stones, names, anything that might throw light upon the past had been systematically altered, end quote, page 124. We'll see when we get to Code Talker how the illusion of an objective past is used to trick Venom Snake, just as it was Winston Smith in the novel. But back to the tapes, which are themselves also a prime example of how, once the past is gone, it's gone forever, given that there are so many things in them that we'll never really know for sure.
I said, do you like what you see? It's like fruit. Does she look sweet or sour? A man has to know these things. Time for a taste test.
After saying time for a taste test, Skullface throws paws down onto the table, positioned like a woman in a pillory. The English word pillock means penis, while the pillory was a torture and public shaming device used to force the subject into a kind of literal forced penal erection, so to speak, almost always used to punish sodomy, as in homosexuality or just sexual acts only for pleasure's sake, like oral sex. According to Jody Green's Public Secrets, Sodomy and the Pillory in the 18th century and beyond, the pillory was routinely used to punish so-called sodomitical offenses. However, the crime itself was considered, even as a word spoken aloud, so infectious, so degrading to public morals that the practice, Green argues, exemplified a contradiction inherent to the foundations of the penal punishment and justice systems of the so-called West. If you're wondering why any of this is in MGSV, just consider the infamous Abu Ghraib scandal. See, by publicly shaming and displaying the so-called sodomite, the English authorities worried that they were possibly teaching the masses that anal sex existed. This conflicted with the Western penal tradition, which used the pillory, quote, to punish sodomy as part of a wider system of public punishment in England that began in the Middle Ages. These punishments included whipping and branding, and all relied wholly or in part upon a notion of shame as a mode of both punishment and deterrence, end quote, page 207. Apart from whipping, as in flagellation, something that we'll talk about when we get to the parasites, sometimes the criminal would have their hair shaved off, just like paws. What made the public pillory so contradictory, of course, was that it embodied the very sexual torture and perversion that it ostensibly was meant to punish as an unspoken invitation to rape. Now, actual rapes of prisoners by the public likely never or very rarely occurred. But the prisoner certainly was made to feel a deep sexual vulnerability, again, to revenge against their own supposed transgression. To quote Frank McLean's Crime and Punishment in 18th Century England, quote, authorities believed pillorying was an ingenious means of co-opting the public into reinforcement of the legal code. Law as overarching ideology was strengthened by this semblance of participation, end quote. Now, although pillorying in England was mainly used to deter and punish so-called sodomites, a word which derives from the story of a mob who rape an angel in the infamous story of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible, the puritanical sects of New England practiced something more akin to sexual torture like Skullface here on women. This they inherited from King James, 6th King of Scotland and the 1st King of the United Scottish and English Crowns, from 1603 to 1625. A few years prior to becoming the United King, he wrote a Witch Hunter's How-To in 1597. It is this text Skullface seems to be referencing all throughout this horrific and terrifying ordeal. King James taught other Protestants, like the ones who settled in New England nearly a century later, to look, in the words of Dr. Kate Lister, quote, for a secret mark that the devil leaves on the body of his disciples. It may surprise you that unlike in the West today, which alleges that men are the lustful ones and women are materialistic, in the 17th and even 18th centuries it was thought the complete opposite way around. It was women's irresistible lust then that supposedly made their entire gender, and only their gender, susceptible to the devil, who would enter them into the sisterhood of witches by having sex with them, specifically by performing oral sex on them. King James, as in the creator of the King James Bible, wrote, quote, the devil doth generally mark them with a private mark, by reason the witches have confessed themselves, that the devil doth lick them with his tongue in some private part of their body, before he doth receive them to be his servants, which may not be easily found out or seen, although they be searched, end quote. Writes Dr. Lister, there are recorded incidents of the teat turning up in the throat, or the belly, or breast of the accused, but more often than not, this mark was found in the genitals after the victim was stripped naked and forcibly searched, end quote. Women were strung up and sexually tortured into confessing that they had a witch's teat inside themselves, which they were forced to say the devil sucked on during acts of oral sex. So there's even an element or grain of homophobia, as I mentioned, not to mention fear and persecution of sex for the purpose of pleasure. We may think of sodomy as meaning only anal sex, but as I intimated before, in reality, as late as 1964 in the state of New Mexico, sodomy was defined as, quote, a person intentionally taking into his or her mouth or anus the sexual organ of any other person or animal. Natural Resources Journal, Volume 8, Number 3, 1968. Of course, what's ironic, writes G. Geiss in British Journal of Law and Society, Volume 5, Number 1, 1978, is the immense double standard that the very same legal system in the so-called West applies to the accusation of rape. This was the system that felt such shame and surety about the perversion of gay sex that William Blackstone, a noted legal scholar from the 18th century, could not specify the act by any English name, having instead to use the Latin substitute peccatum iliad horribile. Quote, I will not act so disagreeable a part to my readers as well as myself, as to dwell upon a subject the very mention of which is a disgrace to human nature. It will be more eligible to imitate in this respect the delicacy of our English law, which treats it in its very own indictments as a crime not fit to be named. Peccatum iliad horribile. Inter Christianos non nominandum, end quote. This Latin phrase at the end means the dreadful sin not to be named by Christians. The same grave seriousness was afforded to charges of witchcraft, if not more so. But how about when a woman would accuse a man of rape? Well, many so-called Western people even now subconsciously echo the opinion of one Matthew Hale, called the most quoted authority on the law of rape in the English-speaking world. In the common law definition of rape, first provided by Hale in the 17th century, it is advised, quote, it must be remembered that rape is an accusation easily to be made and hard to be proved and harder to be defended by the party accused, though never so innocent. This same Lord Hale, writes G. Geiss, quote, played a preeminently significant role in the history of both witchcraft and rape. Hale presided at one of the most notorious of the 17th century English witchcraft trials, where he sentenced 2 accused women to death, end quote. But when you think about all this, is it really any kind of contradiction at all? The same person who claimed total power over women's bodies also claimed that men had more authority, trustworthiness, and credibility, if ever on the wrong end of the accusations. The connections between all of this to Skullface's rape and torture of Paz in front of Chico are legion. So, when Skullface commands Chico to get up, it's to induct Chico as one of them. It's exactly like a crowd in England doing the authorities' work of penalization. It's democratic, populist, the many versus the one, the strong versus the so-called weak, the good against the evil. Skullface only stops one form of horrifying torture to nightmarishly begin another, all the more horrible one. All the pushing, hitting, and shoving has instructed Chico, without the need for words, that might makes right, the moral of social Darwinism. And conversely, right justifies might. Skullface has the power to abuse them, so he is a source of moral instruction and expertise. It's circular reasoning in the extreme, but very effective in terms of its doctrinaire power to degrade everyone involved except for Skullface, who honestly couldn't sink any lower if he tried. When he asks Chico twice, "Do you like what you see?" it not only echoes Brandon from Rope, probably homosexual by the way, it calls back to his earlier advice that this is the kind of woman Chico should learn to want to avoid. She looks sweet and lovely, so this logic goes, but she's hiding a devil inside. In other words, she's a witch. The same, he's suggested, as any and every real woman. Skullface asks Chico, does she look like sweet fruit or sour fruit? An obvious allusion to apples, which we've covered. But next, a reference to the phrase carnal knowledge. A man has to know these things. Skullface is advocating exactly the same double standard as Lord Hale did centuries before him, that a man has the right over a woman's body to explore it and define her essence, whether consensually or not. Women are a creeping menace in need of erecting or pillocking, of interrogating their flesh. The same for anyone else who is immoral, who doesn't know their station, like homosexuals or non-Christians. At least that's the logic that's being sort of satirized here. It is Skullface who is the devil here, though. It's an inversion, just as the witch hunters, not the so-called witches, were the true ungodly sexual perverts. The next line at 7:17 is truly devastating because it subconsciously suggests a castration. Either you take her now or you're strung up next. And in this, Skullface is ironically echoing something that Paz warned him of earlier. Except, unlike Paz, his words have bite to them. It's turned now on Chico. Now this is a test of his own nature, whether or not he's a real man, a real soldier, whether he has what it takes to become a real man and find his own way both in and out. Next, Paz begins to say don't, but then realizing that it will happen whether she wants to or not, relegates herself to at least trying to minimize any trauma for Chico. Even today, if a woman's being raped and accepts her lack of power or control that's been forced upon her by the assailant, this alone can often be enough to legally exonerate the attacker. But this is patently on its face absurd. The whole definition of rape involves having your power, your freedom of choice taken away. It is an ideological blind spot in not only our legal system, but our moral system, the morals that undergird so-called Western society, which prevent a common sense understanding of this very basic point. Paz is trying to stop Skullface from getting what he wants even now. That's how strong and courageous that she truly is. But he's using this against her. He's framing her, or as McLean called it, co-opting her, the way the British Crown co-opted the mob. He's acting through her, like remote controlling her subconscious, her thoughts and deeds. And all she has is the hope, the illusory hope, that anything she does now will truly be a free decision made by her own free will. What unfolds next is truly heartbreaking. Paz has to convince Chico that it's okay, which actually only tortures him worse by seeming to confirm all the misogyny, the puppetry, the speaking for her while using force to keep her silent by Skullface. At 7:30, Paz's "You won't hurt me" is said through gritted teeth and pained breaths. She's already in so much incredible pain, she barely has anything left to lose. Now what happens here is subtle, but no less awful. Chico can't carry out Skullface's ultimatum, not just emotionally, but physically, meaning he can't get an erection. And just before it cuts, we followed this inexorable logic to its unspeakable terminus. To get this over with, Paz has to not only comfort Chico, but help him rape her. She has to cede authority and autonomy to her very own torturer, Skullface, by the proxy of Chico. Even with her superhuman level of resistance, she's dancing to Skullface's tune. There's a subtle hint of rolling thunder, and then nothing. There's now 5 full seconds of empty, penetrating static, a gap, a hole. When we come to, so to speak, from this repression and omission, we hear one of the most mysterious moments in any of Chico's tapes, or at the very least one of the hardest sounds to place. It's a kind of gentle bumping, like the tarps that were struggling against the wind in the old prison, but that's not where we are. Listen close, we're still in the melting pot, so to speak, down in the boiler room. There's the telltale drip at around 7:47. Then, as Chico apparently confesses everything that he knows about MSF and Mother Base, his voice sounds echoey, far away.
Out at sea? Staff of 300? But usually there's... Zeke. And again.
See? That wasn't so hard.
You got what you wanted. Are you satisfied?
We're halfway there.